It's about history, policy, and impact. A new perspective on current affairs, bringing experience, insight, civility, and scholarship to the urgent issues of today. It's about our past, present, and future. Your host, Pulitzer Prize-winning author and journalist, Douglas Blackman. From the University of Virginia's Miller Center, this is American Forum.
Welcome back to American Forum. I'm Doug Blackman. As we approach the 150th anniversary of the final year of the American Civil War, when more than 600,000 soldiers lost their lives in the nation's bloodiest conflict, the events of that time continue to hold an extraordinary grip on the American imagination. Blockbuster films like Steven Spielberg's Lincoln, best-selling books, and an endlessly expanding body of scholarly literature. The rhetoric and divisions of that conflict and its aftermath also still echo in the national political dialogue. Joining us today to discuss how and why we remember that tumultuous period is Gary Gallagher, a leading historian of the Civil War and the John L. Nau Professor of History at the University of Virginia. Gallagher is also the founder and first president of the Association for the Preservation of Civil War Sites. Thanks for joining us, Gary.
Happy to be here.
We're entering this final year of the 150th anniversary of the Civil War, this 5-year period. Lasted from, I realize sometimes people don't actually know when the Civil War was.
They don't know so much.
Which lasted from 1861 to 1865. As we approach this final year of the sesquicentennial, why are we not hearing any more about it than we have?
I think there are a number of reasons that have contributed to the fact that the sesquicentennial hasn't been as prominent as the centennial was. I think one of the key things is that it's hard to talk about the Civil War without talking about a cluster of issues relating to race, and it's sometimes very volatile to talk about race. I think a lot of people have stayed away from it for that reason.
But so talk about that. Talk about the why we should remember the Civil War, or maybe we shouldn't. I'm assuming since you're a historian of the Civil War, you think we probably should remember it. But
I love slow balls down the middle, so go ahead and deliver it. I'm ready. Go ahead.
So why should we remember the Civil War?
We should remember the Civil War because if we don't understand the Civil War, we can't understand United States history over the last 150 years, or really even United States history before that. It's the most important event in our history, in my view, and my view is correct on that. We need to come to terms with the Civil War because it's a point at which we grappled with the very largest issues that we've dealt with as a republic. Issues that had been simmering and had been divisive for all the decades leading up to the war. It's important to look at it for that reason. It ended the institution of slavery, but the most important thing that it did was that it kept the United States together. The 20th century would look incredibly different if the Civil War had turned out differently, because the United States would not have emerged as the great economic and military colossus that it did by the end of the 19th century and moving into the 20th century. World War II would look very different. The Cold War, who knows what the Cold War would have been? It probably wouldn't have featured the United States if there had even been one. So you have to begin with the fact that a single nation emerging as a great economic power, and then soon after that as a great military power, came out of this conflict. So many things would have been different if the Civil War had gone differently, and it could have gone another way. We don't like to think about that, but it could have.
Some people like to think about that.
Old Shelby Foote, yes. South never could have won that war. But the South could have won that war.
But also historians tend to be a little hesitant, with good reason, about this idea of extracting lessons from the past and trying to apply them to the present. But I think that you're more comfortable with the idea that clearly there are some lessons, or at least some similarly instructive aspects of that history that we ought to remember for that reason.
I think the most obvious lesson that we should draw from the Civil War is that gigantic military conflicts are not controllable once they get going, and things come out of them that no one could have anticipated. Going into the conflict in the spring of 1861, no one would have said, well, one thing that's going to happen is the institution of slavery is going to be gone. No one would, or virtually no one. There would have been a tiny group of people that had hoped that would happen, but emancipation isn't part of the Civil War early on and doesn't really become a part for a good ways in. So I think a central lesson is once you get involved in an event like this, almost anything can happen.
We also live in a time when there's a lot of discussion about the invective and bitterness in the national political dialogue now. Is there also something about that there can be consequences from fighting words that maybe are going to be bigger than what one imagines, or is that too much?
Well, I'll say that we hear all the time on the 24-hour news stations, all of them, that maybe we've never been as divided as we are now. We're so divided. As a Civil War historian, I know at least one time when we were more divided than we are now. I mean, knowing about, the only way you can argue something such as that is if you don't know anything about the past. And I think that's another instructive thing about the Civil War, is that it reminds us that almost anything that is at issue now was at issue then. We've been through all of these things before, and understanding of history, I think, makes us better able to cope with what's going on now, because we can realize we've done it before, and here we are, we emerged from it, we'll emerge from this. I think it's very useful in that regard. But of course, words can lead to consequences. I can't imagine words now that would lead to the consequences they led to in the late antebellum years. I simply can't imagine it. But there are consequences. There used to be even more consequences. We used to have politicians who shot one another if you really transgressed a line. Andrew Jackson, if he didn't like something, he might shoot you.
Or beat each other on the floor of the Senate.
Or beat each other on the floor of the Senate into bloody insensibility. Yes, we're divided now, not divided quite the way we were in the mid-19th century.
Though we do have a lot of talk these days, even about secession. You know, there are things that weren't talked about for half a century, and now secession and nullification, and a lot of the precise language that preceded the Civil War.
And I'm happy to say, in case anyone's confused about this, that secession was settled by the Civil War. Secession is not a realistic option. I know some people talk about it, even some people who are in positions of authority
or who
talk
try
about
to become vice president of the United States.
But secession has been settled. It is not going to happen. There is more talk about nullification. It's just another example of what I said a minute ago, that there's almost nothing new, And people think it's new because they're untethered to our past. That's one reason why history actually does matter. It helps us in our current lives. It helps us as citizens in a republic where we're supposed to take an active part in what happens. It allows us to address issues, I think, more calmly and knowledgeably if we don't think everything we're dealing with now has never happened before, because everything's happened before.
And is the enduring fascination with it, this hold it has on the American imagination, that is different from almost every other conflict that we've been a part of, even World War II, which is another that also has its a set of mythologies and sort of fetishes. But is the difference, do you think, I just wonder, is it that the Civil War is still essentially the one unresolved conflict for us intellectually? All the others have a clear outcome. We know who we think won or lost. The Civil War, we're still debating.
Well, the thing about the Civil War is that we both won and lost. That's what sets it apart from all of our other wars. It is our war, entirely our war. It's our only war. I mean, the American Revolution was in essence a civil war in some ways, and even the War of 1812 was to a degree, but not the way this was. This war happened here. It doesn't involve campaigns elsewhere. Most of our wars take place somewhere else. This one took place here, and the white South is the only segment of white America that has ever suffered a shattering defeat. The only part that's ever had to deal with the things that most of the rest of the world has had to deal with. How do you deal with that? How do you deal with utter defeat, an occupation of sorts, although not the kind that the myth of Reconstruction would suggest? I mean, these are things that have a long-term resonance because they are profoundly disruptive and important. And this is the only part of our history where we've had to deal with that.
And so we're still wrestling with them. And every time you make an appearance, as far as I can tell, if I Google your name, every time you take a position that ends up online or make an appearance somewhere, there are a whole battery of people ready to contest any number of things that you've had to say.
Contest is a gentle word. There are people who say really mean things to me on email. Sometimes I just have to sit in a room and feel sorry for myself. Not really. One email person said that what I deserved was a virulent case of pancreatic cancer, which seems to me to be a little over the line.
Yeah, I was expecting a horse whipping, but that's a good, considerably worse.
Yeah, not a regular case, a virulent case, which I thought was a little extra twist. No, they get very upset, especially when you're talking about slavery or things related to slavery, which you have to do if you're talking about the Civil War. You can't do it. People attempt to do it. Many former Confederates tried to airbrush the slavery out of their struggle, and I understand why they did that, because they knew they were out of step with the rest of Western civilization on that. But you just can't do it. And some of the people now who try to do that, they talk about black Confederates in the Confederate Army, which is a hallucination. They talk they try to distance the Confederate battle flag, the St. Andrew's Cross battle flag, from the attempt to establish a slaveholding republic. You just can't do it. And the Confederates never would have tried to do it. They were very upfront about what they were up to. The only way you can argue that slavery wasn't at the center of what they were doing is not to read anything that they wrote at the time. And I'm not interested in what they wrote after the war. Don't tell me anything they wrote after the war. I want to know what they wrote in the midst of events, and what they wrote. Read their Constitution, read the Secession Convention statements, read Jefferson Davis, read Alexander Stephens. I mean, it's slavery's at the center of what's going on. Doesn't mean everybody put on a Confederate uniform because they loved slavery. If you take slavery out of the picture, none of this happens.
And also, I guess the idea that, which there's been more discussion of in recent years, of that it's a misnomer to discuss how many people in the South owned slaves as opposed to how many people's lives relied on the institution of slavery.
The institution of slavery isn't just an economic institution. The entire white South is tied to slavery because slavery controls 3.5 million black people in the Confederate States and 4 million black people overall. It's a system of racial control. By our standards, all Americans in the mid-19th century were deeply racist. That's not a word they would have used, deeply prejudiced. But all the black people lived in the South. The free states were 98.8% white in 1860. So it's not a problem, in quotation marks, for white people living in the North, although they don't want black people around. Illinois has legislation that says black people can't move there. But slavery is a system of racial control. And many in the South they know slaves, although later they pretended slaves were happy. They know they're not happy. Their great fear is Santo Domingo, is Haiti, is a large-scale uprising of black people that would result in large-scale bloodshed. Nat Turner on a grand scale. Harper's Ferry and John Brown on a grand scale. How do you prevent that? The institution of slavery prevents that. It gives you control in this society that has huge numbers of black people. South Carolina and Mississippi are a majority black in 1860.
And after the war, I mean, those are the only places where you actually have black voting majorities as well, right? And much of the discussion about the memory of it today is really about how to deal with the big wave of memory that came at the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century. All the Confederate monuments that are all across the South. We continue to have lots of activity.
Well, I think let me say first that I think some of this is blown out of proportion. The flag on I-95 south of Richmond has gotten a lot of attention. I don't think it's important. 200 or 300 people showed up when they raised that flag. 200 or 300 people, really? And you're going to drive by it on I-95? I think that all the coverage makes it seem more important than it really is. In terms of the national marketplace of understanding of the Civil War, the lost cause is in retreat. There's no question about it. It's not 1935 anymore. There are four main ways, I'll make this very quick, main ways to remember the war. Most of the loyal citizenry remembered it as a war that saved the Union. That's the most important memory of the war, and one we've lost completely. A smaller part, most African Americans and some white Northerners remembered it mainly as a war for emancipation. Most of the former Confederates have the lost cause memory of the war. It's for constitutional principles, slavery's not important. And then later on, there was a memory tradition that's reconciliationist. Let's don't talk about who was right or wrong. Let's airbrush black people out of the picture, and let's just celebrate the virtues that all the white soldiers had. So those are the four main wartime traditions. The lost cause one is the one that gets the most attention now because of incidents such as you mentioned. The dominant tradition now, in terms of how the sesquicentennial understands the war, is the emancipation cause tradition. The movie Lincoln's a perfect example of that. Reconciliation is always lurking around in one way or another, and it has its own real problems. The one of the four that's completely gone, and I mean completely gone, is the one that was embraced by by far the most people who lived through the war, and that's the Union cause tradition, which I find interesting.
And by that you mean just well, let me ask it a different way. At the beginning of the conversation, you were making the point very strongly that it's a crazy fallacy to imagine that the Civil War did not have slavery fundamentally at the core of its causes. But now you're also saying that that the Union imperative was the primary imperative. So reconcile those.
It's the Union. What the war was about for most of the white North was an effort to save the handiwork of the founding generation. This Union that was bequeathed to them gave them things no one else in the world had. They had a profound sense of American exceptionalism, and they were right. White males, I mean, by our standards, is a restricted franchise. By mid-19th century standards, it's unbelievably broad. Almost all white men have a voice in their own government, and they have the possibility to rise economically. No place else has that. That explains the flood of immigration that came in, which they were very well aware of, and they knew Europe was going the other way. Europe is going away from democracy. The failed European revolutions of the 1840s proved to Americans that oligarchs and aristocrats and monarchists were advancing, not declining, and they viewed slaveholders as oligarchs who were anti-democratic, and they believed that this was a tremendous threat to the handiwork of the founders, and that if you lost this war, if it's possible to tear the nation apart just because you don't like who was elected president, then the oligarchs are right. People aren't capable of self-government. This was the last chance for democracy, the last best hope of earth, as Lincoln put it. They believed that. Lincoln didn't have to tell them about that. He is speaking to things that are in the ether. And that's what Union meant, and that's why someone in Vermont would put on a blue uniform and risk his life, when there's no chance that Robert E. Lee is going to march to Burlington, Vermont. That's not going to happen. There's a 0% chance. If we don't understand that about Union, we won't understand the war. Emancipation comes in, not for the reasons we would most want it to come in for most white Northerners. They saw emancipation as a tool to defeat the rebels, as a tool to punish the slaveholding oligarchs who caused the problem in the first place, and as a way to get rid of the only internal political issue that could undo the Union going forward. Maybe 10% of people were really abolitionists. The majority of white people who accepted emancipation as a necessary means in the war, which Lincoln presented it as a military means, it was for those reasons, all related to Union, not related to the moral need for emancipation.
And that's part of the explanation for Lincoln's seemingly contradictory or evolving positions on slavery himself, I take it.
Absolutely, because Lincoln, his personal views, he hated slavery, but he's president who has to win a war. And if he wants the largest number of white residents of the United States to be on board with the war, which means 45% of them who are Democrats and couldn't give a damn about black people, he's got to sell the war as a war for Union. And he does it as late as his address to Congress, his message to Congress in December 1864. He says, we need to pass the 13th Amendment that will kill slavery. This is what's at the center of the Lincoln movie. Why? Because it will be one of the means to achieve what we all agree is the main point of the war, as he put it, Union. Even that late in the war, it's Union. And that's what people would have said at the end of the war as well.
It's interesting you bring up this perception of the slaveholding aristocracy and the oligarchs of the South, and certainly it's the case, obviously, and obviously you're right. I wouldn't dispute anything, any factual claim you would make.
I said they saw them as oligarchs.
Right, exactly.
Yes.
That was the perception, yeah. and certainly in the rhetoric of the abolitionists of the time, this constant message of the sort of venality of the slaveholding classes and that imperative. But it's interesting that at the same time that in American conversation today, many people get uncomfortable about references to American exceptionalism.
Especially in my world, academics
and progressives and liberals.
Sometimes they have heart palpitations.
They recoil
yes.
from
yes,
such an idea.
Yeah. All evidence to the contrary notwithstanding. Well, what I've written that has upset people about the Confederacy is that the Confederate, I think it was a nation. And I think Confederates had a sense of nationalism. And some people have said, well, then you must be a pro-Confederate. I said, I said the Confederacy's a nation. And you don't get the Civil War unless somebody is pretty seriously interested in seeing the establishment of a long-term slaveholding republic, or they wouldn't have fought for so long and wouldn't have lost a quarter of all their white military-age males. I mean, no other part of white America has ever even come close to that. So something is going on there. There's a sense that if you say they're a nation, you seem to be approving of it, which of course no reasonable person would. The Confederates are on the wrong side of things that matter a great deal relating to slavery. But I do think that there is a sense of communal striving on the part of Confederates, and I think it is a natural outgrowth of their sense of being Southern before the war, and I mean white Southerners in a slaveholding society. They have a nascent sense of national feeling before the war. They also think they're Americans, but they have this other loyalty that's powerful, and that loyalty turns very quickly into a Confederate loyalty once the war comes.
It's interesting to me that we're at a point now where if you acknowledge in any way a kind of fascination with the South as it existed before the Civil War, then you're immediately sounding like a Gone with the Wind apologist for the Confederacy. It's almost impossible to talk about aspects of that in a public conversation without first denouncing everything about it. But is there anything to remember? Is there anything to Southern valor and Southern chivalry and principles? Well, is there something worth remembering there?
The question of Southern valor, it's obvious, yes. I mean, were there brave soldiers in the Confederate armies? Of course there were. I mean, there are some spectacular examples of that, not just in R.E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, but in other armies as well. The other armies are losing all the time. It's even more remarkable that those armies, which never won victories, except one, continue in the war. Lee's army at least wins, which is why Lee became such a towering figure in the Confederacy. Lee was many people in the North admired Lee. It drove Frederick Douglass crazy that so many Northerners admired Lee. They admired him as someone who was he never tooted his own horn. They admired him for his sort of Christian humility, for his obvious skill as a soldier. There were things about him that resonated both south of the Potomac and Ohio River and north of the Potomac and Ohio Rivers, and in larger American culture later in the 19th and early 20th century. I mean, that Arlington is a national shrine, the house, to R.E. Lee. There's a great, the disjuncture of the shrine to R.E. Lee, which is the house, and hundreds of thousands of United States soldiers buried all around that house. Why are they buried there? Because that was a way for the United States government to say, we're going to bury our soldiers in your yard, to Robert E. Lee. That's why it's there. So the cemetery's there because Lee was the great rebel. The house is a Lee shrine because subsequently Lee became a kind of national figure. I mean, it's just, you can't make these things up.
Let's talk for a second about battlefields. You've been very involved in the discussions around the preservation of battlefields.
I have.
Why save battlefields at this point? Is there anything to actually learn from a piece of ground anymore?
Another slow ball drifting my way. I really like these. You're a great host. Yes. I think that historic sites are the very best classrooms imaginable. They're just wonderful. You can do things there that you can't do anywhere else. And you can not only, I mean, they're obviously essential if you really want to understand what happened on a battlefield. You can read about them, you can look at maps, but nothing explains the action on a battlefield the way that walking the ground does. You see little wrinkles in the terrain. Oh, that's why that happened. Now I understand why that happened and why they didn't go here, they went there. They're absolutely essential for that, but they are so much more than that. You get people on ground such as that, and they make a connection with the past, and then you can talk about anything. You can talk about why the soldiers are there. Why are the Union soldiers in uniform? What do the Confederate soldiers think is at issue? Not only what happened at this battlefield, but what difference does it make? What impact did the Battle of Chancellorsville have in a broader sense? It made Abraham Lincoln's life far more complicated. It fueled the anti-war movement in the North. It increased, those are the kinds of things that you can do on a battlefield or other historic sites, but you said battlefields, that you can't do, I think, anywhere else.
But how do you sort out what ought to be saved and what ought not to? I spend a lot of time in Atlanta, and just around the corner from the house that I have in Atlanta, there's one of the few, Fort Walker, you may be familiar with.
Yes, it's a postage stamp.
It's a tiny little spot. There was no actual fighting there during the battle, but it's preserved, this little earthen embankment. But what's really the value of a place like that where nothing of any consequence happened?
Well, I think there's actually limited value in a place like that, except as emblematic of what happened in Atlanta. I mean, Atlanta was tiny during the Civil War, and now it's huge, and so it's grown over the actual battlefields of Atlanta. I don't think there's much you can do in Atlanta. Nashville is the same way. Other places are similar. Fredericksburg has even grown over a good part of the famous battle there, but you can save enough at most places. If you can save enough so that you can give a sense of at least one part of the field, I think that's very useful. Other places, Antietam has almost all of the battlefield. Gettysburg has most of the battlefield, although the town has grown over part of it. I don't think you should save every square foot.
Well, this is a critical moment in the war. We're in the second week of May in 1864. And people on both sides had a sense that their best generals were finally going to be confronting one another on the battlefield. Very early on the morning of May the 12th, 20,000 United States soldiers came out of the woods, moved across this ground in our front, and overran the Confederate lines here. They cut Lee's army in two. There's a section of about 200 yards of earthworks here that the Confederates held. And it's this stretch of entrenchments that I think witnessed the most brutal combat of the American Civil War, of the entire Civil War. The soldiers here made it clear in their accounts. They found it very difficult even to describe what went on here. The fighting lasted more than 20 hours. It was literally within arm's reach of one another at some points, fighting on one side or the other of these works with very heavy casualties, with rain pelting down. It was just a ghastly scene. What I try to do with my students to put the Overland Campaign in perspective is to say that in the 6-week period between early May and mid-June 1864, there are more than 65,000 casualties between these two armies. In our nation now, with the number of people we have, that would be the equivalent of 1.1 million casualties. And I asked them what they think Americans would stay hitched to that was costing that much, and I suspect the answer would be nothing. I mean, it's a mind-boggling level of loss.
So on that battlefield near Spotsylvania, the specific battle we visited was called Bloody Angle. You called it in that clip the bloodiest day, or the bloodiest
stretch
of the Civil War, which also I think by definition means that it was the bloodiest day or bloodiest stretch in all of American military history from the...
Certainly one of them.
Yeah, certainly one of them. From the beginning of the Republic, probably, certainly to World War I, maybe to World War II. Possibly. So not just the bloodiest day of the Civil War, but...
No, it's not that Antietam's the bloodiest day of the Civil War, but this is, and you can't quantify these things. It's just that this went on for 20 hours, the raging fight over that little stretch of earthworks. And it was raining, and men would be wounded and pushed down into the trenches and drowned because they weren't dead, but they drowned. And one of the correspondents said that bodies got caught on the top of the trenches and that they were whipped into basket stuff, was his expression. They were hit by so many mini balls going both directions. There's a stump at the Smithsonian that I'm sure some people in here have seen. It's this big around that was cut down only by small arms fire. So many mini balls hit it that oak tree toppled down just before midnight at the fighting. So it's hard to quantify. It was an awful, awful place. And the point that I take from that with students is that it helps illuminate that people believed something was really at stake, because here they are several years into the war still putting up with this. And we know that in our system, our wars end when the civilian population says we're not going to fight this war anymore. We're both old enough to know that's true in Vietnam. It just stops. That's when our wars stop. Well, it hadn't stopped yet at this point.
And the reference you make in the clip to 65,000 casualties is...
That's just United States
just
casualties.
on the U.S. side.
It's
so
about 35,000 on the Confederate side.
So 100,000.
100,000 in 6 weeks. In 6 weeks.
In 6 weeks.
In 6 weeks, yes.
Well, this is something that I think is really profound and important in a conversation about remembering the Civil War. We tend to, and we'll do it some more in this conversation, focus on slavery or focus on the misremembering or focus on these narratives. But we also rarely talk about what you just said, this execution of an idea, of a commitment, a level of intense commitment to a set of principles for which an enormous number of people are willing to die and keep dying and dying and dying. And that seems to be something that, as you suggest, is really not part of the American discussion around anything anymore.
It's not, and I think it's because it's hard, and I'll use union as my example again. That's the most fraught political word of the 19th century, union. It carried more ideological weight than any other word, and it's a word that has literally disappeared from our vocabulary in that meaning. And we think of union, we think of labor relations, we don't think of this, but for them, just mentioning the word union would have brought forth an amazing array of responses and how much that concept meant to people of the mid-19th century. And they all talked about it. Jefferson Davis talked about union. They all talked about union going forward. They have different conceptions of union, but at the heart of it is a system of government bequeathed by a founding generation that had gone through its own crucible, had made its own sacrifices to provide liberty to the white people who lived in this country. And by liberty, they meant a voice in their government and the ability to rise, not the guarantee to rise, but if my father's a cobbler, I don't have to be a cobbler.
You mentioned in the course of that the role of African Americans and how that changed the capacities of the South to wage the war. But another hot button of how we remember this and how we remember it differently. But before we talk about that, this notion of union as being the primary motivating notion for the United States, and it's interesting you always say United States versus...
I always say it's not a war between the North and the South. 4 southern states stay in the United States. Kentucky's a southern state. Kentucky didn't ratify the 13th Amendment until 1975. It seems to me that's worse than not ratifying it at all. We've thought about this for 110 years, and you know, we think slavery was a bad thing. We're on board. No, just don't do it 110 years later. Pretend you did it in the first place. That's what I would do. Yes, oh, that's right, we forgot. I'm sorry for that little digression. But your home state, of course, ratified it in 1995.
Well, and there's still a lot of things on the books in my home state that I'm problematic. But this primary imperative of the United States of being union, to preserve the union, preserve what the founders created at the founding and through the American Revolution. Well, wasn't union also the primary imperative of most Southerners to do the same thing?
What the Southerners would have said they were doing, and they would have said it, and they're not making this up, they would have said, we are the true inheritors of the revolutionary tradition. George Washington owned slaves. Thomas Jefferson owned slaves. James Madison owned slaves. The Constitution protects slave property. You're the ones who are deviating from this, they said to them. You Republicans are the ones. The Constitution, you're making 2 kinds of citizens, they would have argued. You say you can take your property wherever you want to. We can take all of our property but one kind wherever we want to. You don't want to allow us to take our slaves into the territories. You're treating us as a different kind of citizen than everyone else. You're the ones who have broken faith with the founders. That's what they would have said. That was their argument. So they would have said...
And that's what they legitimately believed.
They absolutely believed it, yes. And so the Confederacy to them is merely the extension of the Union as it was created by the founding generation. They would have said that it's the northern offshoot that has taken a different path.
Sort of perverted the Republic.
Right, absolutely. That was their argument. Yeah. And of course, they would have argued that the states created everything, and Lincoln would have said, no, the preamble of the Constitution doesn't say we the states. The preamble of the Confederate Constitution does, but the preamble of our Constitution says we the people. The people precede the states. The states are a creature of the people, according to Lincoln's view of the Constitution.
And so ultimately, the people can make a decision that reorganizes the...
What Lincoln would say, a state doesn't get to undo what the people did. But they both could look to, they both drew from the Declaration. It's Lincoln's favorite document. Jefferson Davis alludes to the Declaration all the time because it establishes the right of self-determination. That's all we're doing, is what our forebears did. And Jefferson Davis would point out, part of the Declaration says one thing that's wrong is that the King of England is interfering with slavery in the colonies.
So let's talk about black soldiers, or the role of African Americans in the war. A kid growing up in the South in the 60s, the 70s, even into the 80s, I think, learning about the Civil War was under the impression that there were no black people involved in the Civil War on either side. And then 25 years ago, the movie Glory came along, and we learned that, oh, there were black soldiers
incredibly important
on the United States side. But now, in the last, since then, we've now had the Sons of Confederate Veterans and all sorts of other neo-Confederate organizations now make the case that there were huge numbers of African Americans fighting for the South. Everybody wants black people in their army now.
Well, the Black Confederate movement, which, as I said earlier, is demented, is an effort to get the Confederacy right on race retrospectively. And you just need to stop that. Anybody who's trying to do it, just stop it. Stop it right now, because you can't win that. What is true is that there were thousands of black men with Confederate armies. That's been airbrushed out too, but they're slaves. And they are with the Army doing all kinds of things the Army needs to have done, they are not serving in the Confederate armies. They are not Confederate soldiers. They are slaves who are there. There would have been thousands of slaves with the Army in Northern Virginia at any given time.
Primarily doing what?
They could have been working as teamsters, they could have been working as cooks, they could have been doing the laundry, they could have been doing all kinds of non-combatant things that need to be done in an army. In 1864, Lee told Jefferson Davis, every white man in the Army, I'm paraphrasing, who isn't shouldering a musket should be replaced by a slave. And so the white man can shoulder a musket. We need our white men fighting. Slaves can do all the rest of this. And Jefferson Davis agreed. And eventually they got to the point where they even considered putting some slaves in the Confederate Army. That was way, way late and didn't make any difference. But black men took care of a lot of the work, just as they did in the United States armies too. There would have been a lot of black men laboring in non-combatant roles before the black soldiers showed up. But the idea that there are thousands and thousands and thousands, I've seen a number as high as 100,000 black soldiers in the Confederate Army. I know what Robert E. Lee would have said to that. He would have said, oh, give me some of them, because I'm running out of white soldiers. Where are all these black soldiers in the Confederate Army? They weren't there. Doesn't mean that some black man at some point didn't pick up a musket and fire at a Yankee. I'm sure that happened when we're talking about so many men. But the black soldiers in the Confederate Army thing, just no.
And the idea that that those who were there, who were doing these heavy physical tasks and probably even moving military equipment at times, things that had a crucial military role, but is then the idea that they were there voluntarily, or that they were there out of some sort of support for the Southern society.
No, they're there because that's what they're told to do. Some of them are working in agriculture, some are working at Tredegar Ironworks in Richmond, some are with the armies.
And are they there out of loyalty to their masters?
Well, is no black man, no slave loyal to his master? Of course some were. I mean, this is another thing that bothers me when we're talking about huge numbers of people. Of course, it's going to be a kaleidoscopic range of relationships and attitudes. So were there some loyal slaves? Of course there were. But do most slaves want to be free? Of course they do. And the white South knew that, which is why they were so afraid of what was going to happen if they didn't keep racial control. The 20 Negro law, which is often deployed, which is a law that said that for every plantation or farm that had 20 Negroes on it, one white man would be exempted from Confederate conscription. That law is often put forward as evidence that there was real class division in the Confederacy and that everybody hated it. No. White people wanted some white men who weren't my age or 11 on the home front. This was something that people embraced, not something that they hated. It's a way to maintain this racial control that they believed was so essential. And most white people knew very well that most black people did not like being slaves. They pretended otherwise later, but their diaries put the lie to that. All you have to do is read what they're saying. They're afraid of what might happen.
Exactly. I mean, how can you be terrified of an insurrection at any moment
if everybody's happy?
If everybody's happy and loves their master. Exactly.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. And so we're swimming in the sea of what would you call it? What would you call this kind of quasi-history?
A quasi-history is fine. That's one of the, I mean, the internet is wonderful. We're always supposed to say that. But there are problems with the internet, and one is that stuff is, and people read something, even on screen. If they read it, they think, then they just start citing it. There were, at the very end of the war, a handful of black soldiers drilling with white soldiers in Richmond because the Confederate Congress had passed legislation in March saying that slaves could be enrolled in the Confederate Army. It came at the very end of the war. It shows how desperate the Confederates were for manpower. It also tells me how important the Confederate nation was to people. It's important enough they're willing to consider putting black men in their army to win the war. I mean, that's quite a switch from where they were in 1861. Lee is the key there. Lee said to do it. Lee said if you do it, however, you have to free the men who are in the army, you have to free their families, and you have to let them live wherever they want to. The Confederate Congress didn't do any of those things. They just said they can be put in the Army, nothing about the incentives that Lee said needed to be in place.
Though it is important to note that you mentioned Tredegar Iron Works, which is the only place at the beginning of the war, if I'm right, in the South, capable of making rolling iron
it's
for
the most
cannon.
important iron, yes, by
Exactly,
far.
and operated almost entirely by slaves. I mean, the workforce.
Some free, some slaves, some white.
Overwhelmingly African Americans and many of them enslaved. And so you have that other irony that both in Virginia and in Alabama, the other industrial center, that it's African Americans who are making a vast portion of the munitions used to preserve slavery.
They make possible the Confederate war effort, absolutely. And that's one reason why Lincoln sold the Emancipation Proclamation as strictly a war measure. This will hurt the rebels. And the proclamation also said you could put black men in blue uniforms. So Lincoln's argument was you hurt them twice. You take labor away from the Confederacy, you either add labor or a soldier to the United States. So maybe even Democrats will accept that, was his thinking. Some did, many didn't. It was the New York City draft riots, as they're always called, were actually a draft/race riot in July of 1863, where these men who didn't want to be conscripted, especially didn't want to be conscripted to fight in a war to end slavery. So those two things come together, and black people were the main target of the rioters in New York after the initial stages of the riot. They burned down a black orphanage, they hanged a bunch of black men, I mean, that's what it became.
Well, all of which goes back to your earlier point that everybody white in America was a racist by
our
today's
standards. Absolutely,
right?
by our standards.
But
nothing's easier than saying, boy, aren't those benighted people in the past? We're so much better. That's what they'll be saying about us in 50 years. Can you believe 2014? Boy, those people were really backward, yes.
The flip side of the whole Confederate black soldier narrative, fantasy, dementia, by your reckoning, the flip side of that would be that there is this ultimately very substantial number of black soldiers who actually fight on the northern side. But have we gotten carried away with the story of the importance of black soldiers for the United States?
I think they're important. They make up 9% of all United States armies during the war, and a higher percentage later in the war when they're about 180,000 black men come into uniform. They do all kinds of things that contribute to the war effort. What they don't do is participate in combat in the same measure that white soldiers do. Black soldiers much less likely to see action in combat than a white soldier. That's partly due to racism, that some of the officers didn't think they do as well, that they were better suited for kinds of labor type work. The movie Glory does a nice job with that. The men of the 54th are clearing a road while the white soldiers go by to fight, and they have a give and take about that. Most of the people in the United States eventually came to accept black soldiers, but I think they tended to think of them as not quite in the same category as white soldiers, although many of the white veterans embraced the black veterans, and there were a lot of mixed race, Grand Army, the Republic Post, for example, after the war, the main Union veterans group. But I think that if we had polled most white soldiers at the end of the war and most white people living in the loyal states and said, what's the most important thing about the war? They would have said Union. And if we would have said, what about emancipation? They would have said, oh, yes, that's important too, but not for the reasons that we would want them to say it. It helped save the Union, not it helped black people. Some would have said it helped black people. I don't think most would have. A lot of white soldiers said, I'm happy to have a black man in a uniform. He might get shot instead of me. But when the war's over, he's still going to be black, and he's not going to be equal to me. I mean, that's a very common sentiment among white soldiers during the war.
You mentioned several, I think 4 narratives of the way the war is remembered and how they have fared and which have still remembered and which are not. There's another one, maybe it's a variation on one of those 4 that I'm interested in, that the overwhelming force, the overwhelming capacity of the North isn't just their good fortune, but that there's a kind of immorality, a kind of technological immorality and dirtiness to the North's power.
How can mere human sinew and bone stand up against this? That's very, very common. But of course, it isn't what Confederates thought going forward or during the war. They weren't suffering from mass false consciousness, or they didn't get together in 1861 and say, I've got a good idea, let's fight a war. We're going to lose 1/4 of all our military-age men, but that doesn't matter, just to make a point. No, of course they didn't. They thought they would win. And they had at hand a perfect example where the weaker side wins, and that is the war against Great Britain during the Revolution. If there'd been a Las Vegas in 1776 and in 1861, the odds against the colonists would have been much longer than the odds against the Confederates. The Confederates have the 4th largest economy in the Western world by some. I mean, they're not, it's not David and Goliath. But retrospectively, if you lose a war you never could have won, there's no loss of honor in losing that war. What there is honor in striving, no loss of honor in losing. And that becomes the explanation with an asterisk, or James Longstreet betrayed Lee at Gettysburg. That's the other one. They're not reconcilable, but take your pick. And, but it's mainly, and of course Shelby Foote in Ken Burns' series, that's what he does at one point when he talks about how the North fought the war with one hand tied behind its back. And all it would have had to do is bring the other hand out from behind its back to win. In other words, of course the North was going to win, of course. I call it the Appomattox syndrome. You start at the end and assume that's the way the story had to end. United States victory and emancipation. Neither one of those is accurate.
Counter to this notion of Lee as this purely gentlemanly figure who was reluctant about slavery and fought for the South just out of his fealty to Virginia, and was not what we would think of as some sort of raging anti-black white supremacist sort of, but this version of him, of the genteel Lee, that in fact there's a letter I think he wrote in 1863 after the Emancipation Proclamation where he describes this as a sort of villainous act by Lincoln.
He's very upset with that. He is not way over on the rabid end of pro-slavery people by any means. I think Lee had what I would call very conventional views, which is he thought of himself as a Southerner, not just a Virginian, and he believed that slavery was the best way to order relations between the races. He was very much in favor of the slave-based society of the Old South and the Confederacy. He hated abolitionists, and he thought that in his own time, as he put it, God would take care of slavery. But for now, this is the best system, and he saw the Emancipation Proclamation as an awful document that basically opened the way for race war. Servile insurrection is the term that they would have used. He was that letter is to the Confederate Secretary of War on January 10th.
This is that we face a degradation worse than death.
Yes, degradation worse than death. That degradation is one of the words that white Southerners would use when they talked about the possible consequences of losing, and that includes race mixing, and that includes, it can be servile insurrection, there are all of these things that can be bound up in that notion, and Lee is conventional. He's not rabid, he's conventional. I think many Southerners would have said he was moderate in his views, but moderation doesn't mean that you're questioning your slave-based society, because he was not.
So let's go back now finally to the part of this whole memory conversation that is most with us on a day-to-day basis outside scholarly work, and that being the monuments, the Confederate monuments specifically. For whatever reason, I don't think the Union monuments that exist present that much of an issue, except when they're ideas of new ones, perhaps.
Or unless it's a statue of Abraham Lincoln and Tad at Tredegar in Richmond, and then you bring out a few, but it's always a few people who are really upset. Go ahead.
But so with the Confederate monuments, though, we have, for the most part, they don't actually espouse explicitly white supremacist ideas. On the other hand, it is an odd thing to have a society as large and complex as ours with this much tribute to what could also be called the most traitorous, the rebellion, uprising that in our history. Sort of a curious thing to devote as much energy as we have to that. But what should happen with monuments? So should they just sit there?
I think that, well, for me, they're great teaching tools. That's what I think they are. And I actually don't believe in airbrushing the past. I don't believe in pulling down monuments. I think that starts you down a bad road. If you start taking down these monuments, well, then maybe we should take down some of these monuments too. And how about some of those? And I just don't, that's not a road I want to start down. I would rather just confront them very pragmatically and honestly. This is what it is. I'm just not on board with pulling things down.
State of Georgia this wasn't a Confederate monument, but it's in the same theme. But Georgia just removed from the most prominent position on the grounds of the state capitol a statue of Tom Watson. A great white supremacist of the 20th century. At the request, ultimately, though the governor won't admit it, but at the request of African-American leaders and legislators. But so you'd be troubled by that?
I would be somewhat troubled by that. And there are, of course, Georgia had this major flag controversy. They had the Confederate flag prominently in their flag, then they had a kind of weaselly middle ground that they went with, and then finally they got rid of it. Just as they took the flag off the state capitol in South Carolina. I have no problem with that. I think you can do that. Those are public property and state, but symbols over public property. Flags are different than other things, I think. When they're flown, the flag along I-95, if people want it, I think
it's free speech.
You have a right to do that. That's free speech. But a flag over the State House is something else. I think that sends a different message.
But what about the idea, though, that if a flag over the State House is an expression of the state in some manner, then isn't the presence of a Confederate monument in front of the courthouse an expression of the county?
Some people would argue that, yeah, they would, that's an expression of the county.
Should they be curated in some way? Should there be some message that explains that this isn't necessarily the view of society?
Yes, I do. That's what I do think. That's what I meant when I said that they should be placed in context and used as teaching tools. That's what I think should happen. And but I know that they will continue to be. They're very volatile. There's no more volatile image in the iconography of American history. There's no more volatile image than the St. Andrew's Cross battle flag, which isn't the stars and bars. Even a lot of people who wave it around call it the stars and bars. Stars and bars, most people wouldn't even recognize. But it's the St. Andrew's Cross battle flag that is the really volatile image. And that's not going to change. It's been misused unbelievably since, never mind the Civil War, the ways it's been used since the Civil War. You know, every time 9 Ku Klux Klan people got together, they had 11 flags. And so you can't pretend that didn't happen. You can't really take care of that.
And was the Confederate flag stolen by the Klan, as some apologists would say, or is it?
I mean, a lot of members of the Klan had worn Confederate uniforms, but I guess they were stealing it from themselves. They used it for, anybody interested in, I'm going to give a commercial here that I hadn't planned on doing. There's a historian named John Koski who has written a wonderful book on the Confederate flag. If you're interested in the Confederate flag, Harvard Press published it. Read John Koski's book. It's really well done, really well done.
And so the bottom line, as we go into the final year of this sesquicentennial celebration of the war, or recollection of the war, what's the most important thing that Americans draw from this final examination of the last year?
I think the most important thing that Americans will draw from the sesquicentennial is that the war brought emancipation, which I think is entirely to the good. You were right about glory. Black people have been airbrushed out of the war, and Glory brought a sea change in that. It was really quite remarkable what a Hollywood film could do. Glory is my favorite Civil War movie. I think that emancipation will be front and center. I wish that people would also bring out of this understanding of the 150th that really, in terms of world history, in terms of the impact on subsequent history, the most important thing that comes out of the war is a united United States, poised to play the role that it played in the world going forward. That without the Civil War, much of history since then would look very different. I wish we had a better sense of that and some sense of what union meant to people at the time.
Thank you for being here.
Thanks for inviting me.
I think that racism definitely is a major factor. It's a sticky point for many Southerners and many people who want to take pride in their heritage, especially in the South, but are worried that this aspect of Southern history would be controversial, and they're not sure how to address it. As a nation, we have still a huge problem confronting racism today, and race and slavery were very central issues to the Civil War, very tricky issues we're still dealing with.
And I agree with him that the monuments should not be torn down. They should be confronted, taught about, dealt with, and explained and used as a teaching tool for education. But definitely I agree that battlefields should be preserved as much as possible as well, as realistically as possible. And the monuments shouldn't be torn down.
But people forget that they were part of an economy that was based upon slavery, and they all fundamentally benefited from slavery, whether or not they actually owned slaves. The other big myth for me is that Southern soldiers were better than Union soldiers, which I don't think was the case. I think that's part of the mythology that went into Southerners dealing with this tremendous sense of loss and trying to find something good about the whole horrible, horrible experience of the Civil War and the desolation it brought across that part of the nation.